Mom, we fired our last shell today. The Japanese are coming through the tunnels toward us. We've been holding these rocks for 3 months, but this is the end. These haunting words were carved into the concrete wall of Malinta Tunnel by 24-year-old Army Lieutenant Robert Chen from San Francisco, California, on May 5, 1942, just hours before Corregidor's final surrender. His makeshift chisel, fashioned from a piece of shrapnel, scraped against the reinforced concrete as explosions echoed through the underground fortress that had become both sanctuary and tomb for the last American defenders in the Philippines. Lieutenant Chen's final message was discovered in 1976 during restoration work on Corregidor Island, when Philippine government workers clearing debris from Malinta Tunnel found his carved words hidden behind a collapsed support beam. The inscription, etched deep into the concrete beside dozens of other desperate messages from doomed American soldiers, provided historians with the most personal account of the final days of America's most prolonged defensive action in the Pacific Theater. What made Chen's testimony particularly significant was the leather field notebook found sealed in a waterproof ammunition case nearby, containing his complete diary from the 27-day siege that transformed Corregidor from Gibraltar of the East into a symbol of American determination in the face of certain defeat. If these forgotten stories of American courage during the darkest days of World War II move you, make sure to subscribe to our channel because we're uncovering the most powerful testimonies from the Pacific that history has almost forgotten. Robert Chen had been stationed at Fort Mills on Corregidor Island since September 1941, serving as a forward artillery observer with the 59th Coast Artillery Regiment. The island, nicknamed the Rock, sat like a massive concrete battleship at the mouth of Manila Bay, bristling with the most powerful coastal defense guns in the Pacific. Its underground tunnel complex, carved from solid rock and reinforced with steel and concrete, was designed to withstand the heaviest naval bombardment the Japanese could deliver. What Chen and his fellow defenders couldn't have anticipated was that they would face not just naval guns but the concentrated fury of an entire enemy air force determined to pound Corregidor into submission before the final ground assault. The fortress that Chen called home was a marvel of early 20th century military engineering, with massive artillery pieces capable of hitting targets 14 miles away, and underground facilities that could theoretically sustain a garrison of 6,000 men for months of siege warfare. Battery Way, Battery Hearn, and Battery Smith housed 12-inch mortars and 14-inch disappearing rifles that represented the pinnacle of coastal defense technology. But by May 1942, most of these powerful weapons had been destroyed by continuous Japanese bombing, and the 11,000 American and Filipino defenders crammed into the tunnel system were surviving on quarter rations while enduring the most intensive bombardment in military history. Robert Chen was the son of Chinese immigrants who had built a small but successful grocery store in San Francisco's Chinatown during the 1920s. His parents, David and Mary Chen, had sacrificed everything to give their 3 children opportunities they had never had, working 18-hour days and saving every penny to send Robert to the University of California, where he studied engineering and earned a commission through the ROTC program. His early letters home reflected the pride of a first-generation American who saw military service as both duty and privilege, describing his assignment to the Philippines as an exotic adventure that would provide valuable experience before beginning a civilian engineering career. The Philippines that Lieutenant Chen arrived at in late 1941 was a tropical paradise on the verge of war, where American military personnel enjoyed a comfortable colonial lifestyle complete with Filipino servants, private clubs, and weekend excursions to mountain resorts. His initial diary entries captured the casual confidence of an army that had been in the Pacific for 40 years without facing a serious challenge, describing elaborate social events, hunting expeditions, and the routine peacetime duties of coastal artillery units whose main concern seemed to be maintaining equipment that might never be used in actual combat. Chen wrote about the beauty of Manila Bay at sunset, the exotic foods he was learning to enjoy, and his growing friendship with Filipino soldiers who served alongside American forces with apparently unshakable loyalty. But as diplomatic tensions with Japan escalated throughout the fall of 1941, Chen's diary entries began reflecting the growing awareness that war was not just possible, but probable. Intelligence reports spoke of massive Japanese military buildup throughout the Pacific, and American forces in the Philippines began intensive training exercises designed to test their readiness for actual combat. Chen participated in blackout drills, practiced loading and firing the massive coastal defense guns, and learned to navigate the complex tunnel system that would become his world during the siege ahead. His technical background made him particularly valuable as an artillery spotter, responsible for directing the fire of Corregidor's big guns against enemy ships and landing craft. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, reached Corregidor through crackling radio transmissions that seemed almost unreal to soldiers who had been living in peaceful routine just hours earlier. Chen's diary entry for that day captured the shock and disbelief that swept through American forces as they realized that the war they had been preparing for was no longer a possibility, but a reality that would test everything they had learned about soldiering. Within hours, Japanese aircraft appeared over Manila Bay, beginning a campaign of systematic destruction that would transform the Philippine archipelago from an American colonial possession into a Japanese conquest in just 5 months. The fall of Manila on January 2, 1942, marked the beginning of Corregidor's transformation from a comfortable garrison post into a fortress under siege. Chen wrote about watching the smoke rise from burning buildings across Manila Bay as Japanese forces consolidated their control over Luzon Island, cutting off all land-based supply lines to the rock and leaving its defenders completely dependent on whatever supplies could be smuggled in by submarine or fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness. The abundance of peacetime quickly gave way to careful rationing as commanders realized that the siege might last for months rather than weeks. Have you ever wondered how American soldiers, cut off from all support and facing certain defeat, found the strength to continue fighting when surrender might have seemed the rational choice? January 5, 1942 marked the beginning of systematic Japanese air attacks on Corregidor, as enemy bombers based on captured airfields throughout Luzon began the methodical destruction of the rock's surface installations and defensive positions. Chen's diary entries from this period revealed both the awesome power of Corregidor's defensive capabilities and the growing realization that traditional coastal defense concepts were inadequate against the kind of sustained aerial bombardment that modern air forces could deliver. The island's anti-aircraft guns, designed primarily to engage low-flying torpedo bombers, proved largely ineffective against high-altitude formations that could drop their bombs with relative impunity while staying beyond the range of defensive fire. The first major test of Corregidor's combat effectiveness came on January 29th, when a Japanese naval task force approached Manila Bay in an apparent attempt to force the entrance and attack American shipping anchored near the fortress. Chen was stationed in one of the forward observation posts when the coastal defense batteries opened fire, their massive shells creating towering waterspouts around enemy cruisers and destroyers, as American gunners demonstrated the accuracy and power that had made Corregidor famous throughout the Pacific. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours, but it resulted in significant damage to Japanese warships and forced the enemy task force to withdraw beyond the range of the rock's big guns. This early victory provided a tremendous boost to American and Filipino morale, proving that Corregidor's defenders could still strike back effectively against Japanese forces despite their growing isolation from outside support. Chen wrote about the celebration that followed the naval engagement, describing how soldiers and civilians throughout the fortress complex shared in the satisfaction of having inflicted real damage on an enemy that had seemed invincible since Pearl Harbor. The successful defense against naval attack also demonstrated the continued effectiveness of traditional coastal fortification concepts when properly employed, giving defenders confidence that they might be able to hold the rock until relief forces could arrive from the United States or Australia. But Japanese commanders had learned valuable lessons from their unsuccessful naval probe, and subsequent attacks focused on systematic destruction of Corregidor's defensive positions through sustained aerial bombardment rather than direct naval assault. Beginning in February 1942, enemy bomber formations appeared over the island on a daily basis, conducting carefully planned attacks on specific targets, including ammunition storage areas, command bunkers, communication facilities, and the massive coastal defense batteries that represented Corregidor's primary offensive capability. Chen documented the progressive degradation of the fortress's fighting capability as one by one, the big guns were knocked out of action by direct hits or damaged beyond repair by near misses that cracked concrete emplacements and twisted steel gun mounts. The psychological impact of continuous bombardment proved almost as devastating as the physical damage, as defenders learned to live with the constant threat of sudden death from bombs or artillery shells that could strike anywhere on the island without warning. Chen wrote about the different ways men coped with the stress of prolonged combat, noting that some soldiers became withdrawn and fatalistic, while others developed an almost manic cheerfulness that seemed to deny the reality of their situation. The underground tunnel system provided physical protection from most aerial attacks, but the confined spaces and artificial lighting created their own psychological pressures, as thousands of men learned to live like moles in an underground world where day and night lost all meaning. Food became an increasingly critical concern as the siege entered its second month, and supply runs from other Philippine islands became virtually impossible due to Japanese control of surrounding waters. Chen documented the progressive reduction in daily rations, from full meals to half portions, to the meager sustenance that barely kept men functional during the final weeks of the siege. Fresh fruit and vegetables disappeared entirely, replaced by canned goods and preserved foods that provided basic nutrition but did little to maintain the health and energy levels necessary for effective combat operations. Medical supplies also ran critically short, forcing doctors to make agonizing decisions about which wounded men would receive treatment and which would be left to recover or die without proper medical care. March 1942 brought a dramatic escalation in Japanese efforts to reduce Corregidor through sheer weight of explosives, as enemy artillery positions established on nearby Bataan Peninsula began systematic bombardment of the rock's defensive positions and underground facilities. Chen's diary entries from this period captured the terror and exhaustion of men living under continuous shell fire, describing how the constant explosions made sleep impossible and gradually wore down even the strongest personalities through sheer psychological attrition. The combination of aerial bombing during daylight hours and artillery bombardment throughout the night created a 24-hour cycle of violence that pushed human endurance beyond its normal limits. The artillery bombardment proved particularly devastating because Japanese gunners had established their positions on high ground overlooking Corregidor, giving them direct observation of their targets and the ability to adjust fire based on visual feedback from each shell burst. Chen wrote about watching enemy observation planes circle overhead during bombardments, directing artillery fire with scientific precision that gradually destroyed every above-ground structure on the island and created a lunar landscape of shell craters and scattered debris where once there had been buildings, roads, and carefully maintained military installations. The systematic nature of the destruction convinced many defenders that the Japanese were determined to obliterate Corregidor entirely, rather than simply force its surrender. Living conditions in the tunnel complex deteriorated rapidly as more and more personnel crowded into underground spaces that were never designed to house the entire garrison for extended periods. Chen documented the health problems that inevitably resulted from thousands of men living in confined spaces with inadequate sanitation, insufficient fresh air, and no opportunity for proper exercise or recreation. Dysentery and other intestinal ailments became endemic, weakening defenders at precisely the time when they needed maximum physical strength to maintain their positions and operate the remaining weapon systems. The medical staff, already overwhelmed by combat casualties, found themselves dealing with a second wave of illness and disease that threatened to incapacitate the garrison, even if Japanese attacks didn't succeed. The progressive destruction of Corregidor's communication systems created increasing isolation from the outside world and growing uncertainty about the overall strategic situation in the Pacific theater. Chen wrote about the rumors and speculation that circulated through the tunnel complex as soldiers tried to piece together information from fragmentary radio transmissions and occasional messages from submarine crews who managed to reach the island under cover of darkness. Some reports suggested that massive American relief forces were being assembled in Australia or Hawaii, while others hinted that the entire Pacific Fleet had been destroyed and that no help was coming. The lack of reliable information created a psychological burden that was almost as difficult to bear as the physical hardships of the siege itself. By April 1942, it had become clear that Corregidor's ability to continue effective resistance was rapidly diminishing, not only due to the destruction of weapons and equipment, but also because of the physical and mental exhaustion of the defenders themselves. Chen's diary entries from this period showed a marked change in tone, moving from the confident professionalism of earlier months to a grimmer acceptance that defeat was inevitable unless circumstances changed dramatically. He wrote about friends and fellow officers who had been killed or wounded, about the progressive reduction in ammunition supplies, and about the growing realization that Corregidor had become a symbol rather than a genuine military threat to Japanese operations in the Philippines. What do you think motivated these isolated American defenders to continue their resistance when they knew that defeat was inevitable and that the outside world had seemingly abandoned them to their fate? May 5, 1942 began with the most intensive bombardment that Corregidor had yet experienced, as Japanese forces prepared to launch their final ground assault against the fortress that had defied them for nearly 4 months. Chen's diary entry for that morning captured the apocalyptic nature of the barrage, describing how the entire island seemed to shake and buckle under the weight of explosives, as enemy artillery and aircraft concentrated their fire on the remaining defensive positions and the entrance to the tunnel complex itself. The bombardment continued for 18 straight hours, creating a hellish landscape where nothing could survive on the surface, and even the underground shelters offered only marginal protection against the heaviest shells and bombs. The Japanese ground assault began at midnight, with specially trained amphibious troops landing on Corregidor's beaches under cover of continued artillery fire and supported by tanks and flamethrowers brought across from Bataan Peninsula on improvised barges and landing craft. Chen was part of a small group of defenders positioned near the tunnel entrance when the first enemy troops appeared through the smoke and debris, their shapes barely visible in the darkness as they advanced methodically through the devastated landscape toward the heart of American resistance. The fighting that followed was desperate and confused, with small groups of American and Filipino soldiers making stands wherever they could find cover among the shell craters and collapsed buildings. The most crucial battle took place around Malinta Tunnel itself, as Japanese forces recognized that capturing the underground complex would effectively end organized resistance on Corregidor regardless of what happened elsewhere on the island. Chen wrote about the surreal experience of fighting a battle that took place both above and below ground simultaneously, with explosions echoing through the tunnel system while rifle and machine gun fire rattled overhead as defenders tried to prevent enemy troops from reaching the entrances to their underground refuge. The tunnel's multiple levels and interconnecting passages created a three-dimensional battlefield where the advantage could shift rapidly depending on which side controlled key junctions and stairways. As Japanese troops penetrated deeper into the tunnel system, the fighting became increasingly brutal and personal, with hand-to-hand combat in the narrow passages and desperate attempts by American defenders to prevent the enemy from reaching the areas where wounded soldiers and civilian personnel had taken shelter. Chen documented acts of extraordinary heroism by individual soldiers who sacrificed their lives to buy time for their comrades, including men who deliberately triggered explosive charges to collapse tunnel sections, even though they knew the explosions would kill them along with attacking enemy troops. These desperate measures slowed but could not stop the Japanese advance, as superior numbers and fresh troops gradually overwhelmed defenders who had been fighting continuously for months. The end came at dawn on May 6th, when General Jonathan Wainwright, commanding the remaining American forces in the Philippines, made the agonizing decision to surrender Corregidor rather than watch the complete destruction of his command in a final hopeless battle. Chen's last diary entry, written just minutes before American forces laid down their arms, consisted of the carved message that would be discovered 34 years later. Mom, we fired our last shell today. The Japanese are coming through the tunnels toward us. We've been holding these rocks for 3 months, but this is the end. These words, etched into the concrete with desperate urgency, captured the heartbreak and pride of men who had fought to the limits of human endurance and beyond. The surrender of Corregidor marked the end of organized American resistance in the Philippines and completed one of the most devastating defeats in United States military history. Of the 11,000 American and Filipino troops who had defended the rock during its 27-day siege, nearly 1,000 had been killed and thousands more wounded in the final battles. The survivors faced an uncertain future as prisoners of war, not knowing whether they would live to see their families again or die in Japanese captivity. For Chen and his fellow defenders, surrender meant the beginning of a new kind of ordeal that would test their courage and determination in ways that combat never had. Lieutenant Robert Chen's survival through 3.5 years of Japanese imprisonment represented a triumph of human will that paralleled the heroic defense of Corregidor itself. The march into captivity began immediately after the surrender, as Japanese forces organized the captured garrison into columns for transport to prison camps throughout the Philippines and eventually to labor camps in Japan, Manchuria, and other parts of the Japanese Empire. Chen wrote about the shocking contrast between the respectful treatment he had expected as a prisoner of war under international law and the brutal reality of Japanese military culture, which viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor and treated captured enemies accordingly. The psychological adjustment to captivity proved almost as difficult as the physical hardships, as American officers trained to lead and take responsibility found themselves powerless to protect their men from systematic abuse and deliberate cruelty. Chen documented the progressive breakdown of military discipline and organization as Japanese guards deliberately separated officers from enlisted men and prevented the maintenance of American command structures that might provide comfort and stability to prisoners facing an uncertain future. The loss of military identity and purpose left many former defenders struggling with depression and despair that proved more dangerous than the physical privations of prison camp life. Yet even in the darkest circumstances of imprisonment, Chen found ways to maintain his connection to the values and memories that had sustained him during the siege of Corregidor. He organized clandestine educational programs for younger prisoners, teaching mathematics and engineering principles using improvised materials, and relying entirely on memory for technical content. He helped establish communication networks that allowed American prisoners to share information and coordinate resistance activities, including sabotage operations against Japanese industrial facilities that used prisoner labor. Most importantly, he continued documenting the experiences of Corregidor's defenders, recognizing that their testimony might someday serve as historical evidence of both American heroism and Japanese war crimes. The hidden diary that Chen maintained throughout his imprisonment became a collaborative effort, with other Corregidor survivors contributing their own memories and accounts to create a comprehensive record of both the fortress's defense and the subsequent treatment of its captured garrison. This underground archive, carefully concealed despite the enormous risks involved, represented a form of resistance that Japanese authorities could never completely suppress. Chen wrote about the importance of bearing witness to events that might otherwise be forgotten or distorted by official histories, understanding that the truth about Corregidor's siege needed to be preserved for future generations, regardless of whether the prisoners themselves survived to tell their stories. Liberation came on September 2, 1945, when American forces landed on Luzon and began the process of locating and evacuating prison camps throughout the Philippines. Chen's diary entry from that day was brief, but emotionally overwhelming. Free. We are free. After 3 years, 8 months, and 27 days, we are free. But freedom brought its own challenges as survivors struggled to readjust to a world that had moved on without them and to process the trauma of prolonged captivity under brutal conditions. Many former prisoners found that their families and communities had given them up for dead and had difficulty understanding or accepting the men who returned from Japanese captivity. Chen returned to San Francisco in October 1945, Weighing less than 110 pounds and suffering from multiple tropical diseases and the effects of prolonged malnutrition. He was medically discharged from the Army in 1946 and spent several years recovering his health while trying to rebuild his life in a country that seemed strangely foreign after his prolonged absence. He married his college sweetheart in 1948, started a successful engineering consulting business, and raised 3 children who grew up hearing stories about their father's experiences on Corregidor and in Japanese prison camps. But Chen never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of those years, and his family noticed that he would often stand at his window in the evening, staring out at San Francisco Bay as if remembering another island in another ocean where he had learned the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. Lieutenant Robert Chen died in 1987 at the age of 69. Having lived long enough to see Corregidor transformed from a forgotten battlefield into a memorial park dedicated to Filipino-American friendship and the shared sacrifices of World War II. His diary, donated to the MacArthur Memorial Foundation by his family, remains one of the most complete first-person accounts of the siege and its aftermath, providing historians with invaluable insights into both the military aspects of the defense and the human cost of America's longest siege operation. The carved message that was discovered in Malinta Tunnel continues to move visitors from around the world, serving as a permanent reminder that ordinary Americans can display extraordinary courage when their country and their comrades depend on them. Today, Corregidor Island serves as a memorial to the Filipino and American forces who defended it during those desperate months in 1942. Its restored tunnels and gun emplacements standing as testament to the determination and sacrifice of men who held their ground against impossible odds. The Rock's 27-day siege proved that American forces could fight effectively against Japanese troops when properly prepared and courageously led, providing crucial lessons that would be applied throughout the long campaign to recapture the Pacific. More importantly, the defense of Corregidor demonstrated that military defeats could become moral victories when they inspired others to greater efforts and reminded the world that freedom is worth defending regardless of the cost. Did you know that Corregidor's 27-day siege became a symbol of resistance throughout the occupied Philippines, inspiring guerrilla fighters and civilian resistance groups who drew strength from the example of Americans and Filipinos who had refused to surrender even when defeat was certain?